Okay, good afternoon. My name's Nick Scott. I'm going to talk to you today about enhancements that we've made to the dynamic property feature, which we introduced in Jade 7.0. I'm going to start just by giving an overview, revision of what dynamic properties are in 7.0, and then we're going to look at the changes that we've made in 7.1, a couple of demos and a couple of demos. So in 7.0 we introduced dynamic properties as a way for applications to be able to extend the definition of a class, to be able to store properties without data or values for properties without requiring any need for a reorg. The application would be up and running and no impact on classes being in use and so on. Now the values that are stored for the properties are stored in a what we're calling a cluster, which is effectively a sub-object of the main object, and the properties are assigned to the cluster as you assign values to the property. So the cluster gets created automatically, and much like a blob, it gets longer as you assign more properties to it. So there's an example of what a static class would normally look like. You have all the properties would be there. It's a fixed size object. If you say that you've got half a dozen properties, then every instance has space assigned in the database for each of those properties. Whereas a cluster, the values will get appended as you assign the property values. If you update an existing property value, then we'll replace the value in the cluster. It's important to remember that we're only assigning property values as they're assigned in logic. So cluster, there is no overhead associated with having the property definition. Whereas with a static property, you've now automatically, if you've got a 100 character string, you've got 100 characters sitting in every instance. So in 7.0, you would define clusters and dynamic properties in runtime logic. There are some in your Jade code or your C# code. We have a bunch of methods on the various root schema classes, and you define the cluster, define the property, and that's it. You can then start using it. There is no direct access to the properties that you've defined, that you've just declared, so you had to use set property and get property value. So here were some examples where, so programmatically, we're creating a cluster on the customer class, and then we add two dynamic properties to the cluster. When we wanted to use that property at runtime, we would use get property value and set property value. And the supported data types, all primitives, references, blobs and slobs, support for exclusive collections, and support for inverses. But the inverses have to be, in 7.0, the inverses have to be between just other dynamic properties. You can't have an inverse to an existing static property. Now, you do all this in Jade 7.0. You'll see the properties in the browser, but you can't do much with them. You can't add them or change them. You have to change them in runtime logic. You can't access them directly in your Jade methods. As I mentioned, you have to use set property value and get property value. No inverses to static properties. And when you extract your schema, we don't go and find although the properties appear in the browser, we don't extract them as part of the schema. And so of course we can't load them when you load them back in. You would have to, as part of your application, would have to recognise that the property has not been defined when you deployed a new version and run some application initialization code. You couldn't use them, you can't use them in a bunch of places. You can't use them as a key of a dictionary, and ODBC, RPS, so on. Incidentally, you can actually use them as a key of a Dyna dictionary, but not of a statically defined dictionary in the model. So, that's the revision. Now, what we've done is we've branched the concept of dynamic properties. We've still got the same runtime implementation, but we've got runtime dynamic properties, which are what I've just described pretty much for 7.0, and we're now allowing you to design and model dynamic properties. So you still get the advantages of the storage and the reduced, and sometimes there is no reorg requirement, as we are going to see. So the runtime dynamic properties are pretty much, in 7.1, it's exactly what you've got in 7.0, except they look a little different in the IDE. We've changed the colour, is pretty much it. The same restrictions apply. You can't use them in a bunch of places. We don't extract them as schemas or anything like that. Design time dynamic properties. Well, now what we've got in 7.1 is the ability to create, to define clusters in the IDE, and you can view the cluster, see what properties are in it. You can now, once you've got and you can define also define the properties in the IDE, you can access them directly in your code, and that gives us the benefit now that we have got the property references, so you can see where this property is being used. We extract them as part of the schema, load them back in, effectively part of your model. You can use them as keys for dictionaries, you can use them as inverses, and we support them in lots of places that we don't support the runtime dynamic properties. We don't currently support the design time dynamic properties in RPS and audit access. The issue with audit access is effectively what we've got is we've got this self-describing blobby bit of data which has got all the values in it, and it's being able to determine which properties have actually changed is a reasonable task. So not yet. So clusters, we've now got design time and runtime dynamic properties. A cluster can contain either, both, or neither. You can't delete a cluster at design time if it contains runtime properties, and similarly you can't delete it at runtime if it contains design time. So if you're mixing your design time and runtimes, just need to bear that in mind. And if you assign, effectively if you add a property to a cluster, you can't change the cluster that it's assigned to, because that would mean we'd have to go and find that data and move it. And you can't add a cluster, effectively, so now you can't have a dynamic property on a collection class. Now that's because we can't identify a sub-object of a sub-object. So if we've got an exclusive collection, having a sub-object, which itself is a sub-object, having another sub-object of it makes such finding it impossible in Jade. If you've got a non-dynamic property, you can't suddenly magic it into a dynamic property. They're stored completely differently, vice versa as well. You can't currently change a design time dynamic property to a runtime dynamic property. That is a current restriction. We just got to look at the implications of it. May be as simple as saying, hey, it's changed. Therefore, we can just change the state. We don't have any data considerations to take into account. And you can't, in runtime, use the change dynamic property method, which you would use to change a runtime property. You can't apply that to a design time property. You need to do that in the IDE as part of your model. So, let's have a little look. So, on the class menu now, there's a dynamic property cluster menu. So we can see in this case, actually, if I just go back here, we can see that I've already added the cluster, so it's showing when I've selected the class. If I go to the cluster, I can select it, it'll show me what properties are currently assigned to that cluster? Currently nothing. So here's the code that I showed you earlier, which is going to go away, and it's basically we're going to add a dynamic property to that cluster. So this is what you'd be doing in 7.0, and you'll see now, lo and behold, the property has now appeared in the IDE, and now in 7.1 it's colorized, and the details tell us if we select it. If we go back to the cluster menu, you'll see when you select the cluster, there it is. Hey, really good. So what we now on the properties menu, we've got two new menu options for dynamic attribute and dynamic reference. So these are now for adding design time dynamic properties. And the dialogues that you see, pretty much what you're used to seeing when you're adding a normal property. Couple of differences. One, you've got a checkbox up there to remind you. You can't actually uncheck it. It's there as a cue to let you know what you're doing. And you've also got a combo to select the cluster, and so that's populated now. We've only got the one cluster in here. So we're going to we'll add I'll call it design time string. So now you can see we've got a runtime string and we've got a design time string. It's colorized slightly different in the IDE. We go to the cluster and the cluster shows both properties as being in there. Now, if we can use that property directly in Jade code, in 7.0 or with a runtime dynamic property, you'd have to use set property value. So we've got it, and it looks just like a property, behaves just like a property, because to all intents and purposes it is. We're only restoring the value differently. So now when I come to the design time string, I can use the IDE to show me references to the property. So I can say it's just the IDE is treating it as just a normal property. Now similarly we can have collections. So I can have a dictionary of my C1s, and I can notice in here that I can choose the design time string, but I can't choose the runtime string. It's not part of the model, so I can't use it as a part of a key for something that is statically defined. So now we see, hey look, we used it as a key. It's a key in C1, and it's a design time set of properties. So that's all really good. So now what I can do is, now that I've got the dictionary class, I can add a reference . Let's stick an inverse in here. Now notice that I'm adding because I came into this dialog box and I said I'm adding a design time reference, and I'm going to create the reference on the other side, or in this case the collection on the other side. It's also a design time dynamic property because it's new. If you create if you're creating a new inverse, you can select an existing static property, but if you create a new property as part of the adding the inverse, they're both going to be design time dynamic. Similarly, if I've been adding the inverse as a static property and I said define inverse, I'm going to end up with static properties. Clear? So there we go. We've added the inverse. So really, this is nothing new. You've seen this all the time with normal properties, but what I'm showing you now is that this is happening with these runtime properties. In 7.0, you can't do any of this if you're using dynamic properties, but now with the design times, we've effectively, as I say, made them first-class citizens.
And if you add a cluster to a class, does it cause a reorg of the class?
No. No. And adding a cluster, it's purely a definition, and it's not until you actually add. You can't put anything into a cluster until you define the property that's going to be assigned to it. No, there's nothing, no real.
So it's never a reorg of an object that gets one of these added to the design time or runtime.
Correct.
And I assume you don't get an addition on the property, do you? You get an addition on that? You know which addition it is, or?
The cluster and the instance are tied together. So much. I mean, if the property is embedded, you've got a single view of you've got the object. If you update a static property in the same transaction that you're updating a dynamic property, then there's addition checking to make sure that everything's all kept in sync.
But if you update just a dynamic property, what update the addition?
The addition on the parent changes because the object has if you update a slob, for example, so you've got a sub-object, then the parent object changes. Now, in 7.0 with the runtime dynamic properties, there was never a reorg involved. You could add the cluster, as I've just said with Kerry, you add the cluster, you add the properties, and you go ahead, the classes can be in use, your application's up and running, and it all happens on the fly. Never any reorgs. With design time dynamic properties, properties can be added to classes with instances, and the reorg is optional, the versioning is optional. We're leveraging the fact that we can add clusters and we can add dynamic properties without having to reorg the data, but you may want to version the data because you're working on a release or whatever. So there's you'll see this in action in a minute, but if the schema is not already versioned and you've got and you're adding a non-inverse property or you're adding a primitive, changing a non-keyed property, the IDE will say, hey, I can make that change, but I don't have to version the data, version the schema. What do you want me to do? And you say yes or no, or cancel to give up. If you say no, then you can carry on much like you would have with a runtime dynamic property. We now have the properties defined, and you can start using it. There's no reorgs involved at all. Now, some of the changes that you're going to be modelling with the design time dynamic properties, we do have to do a reorg. If keys for dictionaries are going to be changed, or if we've got to populate inverses, then that is done as part of a reorg. So now we're now into reorg territory. What we're not doing is we're not doing any mutations. Now there are two parts to the reorg. When you kick it off, if you've ever looked at the reorg log, you'll see that it's reorging, it's mutating the instances in the database files. If you've added a property or you've removed a property, then we've got to go and find all those definitions, and we've got to make them bigger or smaller depending on whether you've added or removed properties. So that all happens, and that's what we call the database mutate. Then we go into a second phase, which is going to be populating inverses, rebuilding dictionaries for change keys, and so on. Now, with dynamic properties, we don't need to do the mutate, with the exception of dynamic blobs and slobs, because we've got to go and find these sub-object instances and remove them. But we can handle deletions of embedded properties within the dynamic cluster layout. So, let's have a look. So we'll start with a class. Control Y didn't work. So we've got some instances. So let's add, we'll add a name to the product. Remembering that we've got instances, so we're going to add, it's a dynamic property. Okay, so there are instances of the class. The IDE says, well, what do you want me to do here? Do you want to go and do a reorg or not? And in this case, I know that I don't want to because it looks better in a demo. So now we've added the property, and there it is. If I now inspect instances of the product class, there we go. Our instances are there, but there's no value assigned to the property. In this case, whilst I've got a cluster, we've never populated any data, so effectively the sub-object doesn't exist for any of these instances. And I just happen to have a script here that's going to go away, and as it's going through, it's going to go through all the instances, and it's going to assign a value to the name property of every second instance. So the first guy is still null, and the second guy we've assigned a value to it. So that property has now, that value is all being maintained. We didn't have to reorg anything, it's all really good. Now, I've got a dictionary, which I've defined here, product dictionary, and I'm going to go and add. So in product, I've got a company reference, which is a static property. I use the static term, non-dynamic property, and I'm going to inverse that. I'm going to create a dictionary on company to inverse, using a dynamic property to inverse back to that guy. So I want to add on here a product dit, putting it into our company cluster. So now I'm selecting the existing non-dynamic property. So the cluster combo doesn't take any, isn't required here. Add the inverse. And now when I click on the OK, well, I've got no choice. I have to do a reorg because I've got to maintain the integrity of the inverse. So Jade needs to do the reorg to populate the collection that I've just added. So that's all. I mean, this would happen for normal non-dynamic properties. There's nothing new here. I'm just wanting to make you aware that with a dynamic property that there are implications for whether or not there's going to be a reorg. So now our company instance has now the collection got populated as part of a reorg. So you could have, whilst with a design time, with a runtime dynamic property, you could add an inverse like this. You'd have to go and do the population of it yourself. Here, the Jade, we've got Jade to populate it as it would normal non-dynamic properties. Which one's which? So now we've got 3 types of properties to choose from. Which one do I use? I'm spoiled for choice. Why would you not want to use a dynamic property? Well, if you haven't migrated to 7.0, then sorry, you haven't got a choice. So if you've got a static property, If you don't care whether or not you're going to have to do a reorg, then by all means make it static. Don't even think about using a dynamic property. If you're really concerned about performance, then you stick with a non-dynamic property. A cluster is a sub-object. So if you're going to, at worst case, you're going to have to go and fetch 2 objects into memory to access that property. If it was an embedded property, then you'd only have the one I/O. If it's a dynamic slob, you've now got 3 objects to contend with. So if you're really worried, the overhead of accessing a slob is about 70 or 80%. So it's not twice as slow, but if you're really worried about it, then other than that, you might like to think about using a dynamic property. Would you use a runtime dynamic property? Well, if your application doesn't really know what these properties are going to be, then how can you put them into your model? Now there are we've got Jade applications now, this is exactly what happens. They get a CSV loaded, and they say, okay, we want to load this, and we're going to create a class, we're going to create properties, and we don't know what they are. So in that case, there we're getting it's their runtime dynamic properties, and the property definitions in this case, they're not part of the model, they're part of the data, they're part of the application, and they could vary from one instance of the application to another instance. You could have user A that's got these properties defined on the user, and user B's got a completely different set because they've loaded they have different requirements. And so we're not extracting them, we're not loading them, it's not deployed, then this is a runtime dynamic property. Design time dynamic properties, you start thinking about this if you've got millions of instances of a class and you know that reorg is going to take too long. Maybe you want to be thinking about using a design time dynamic property. You know if it's it's going to be part of your model, and sorry. And you're going to be writing code that's going to be accessing it. Accessing a design time dynamic property directly rather than set property value, get property value, is an order of about 10 times faster. So bear that in mind. And you won't maybe be using them as keys. I've mentioned that the property values for dynamic properties are only assigned to the cluster as you assign the values to the property. So if you've got a property that you want to add and only some instances are going to have a value, then that's probably a good candidate for having a dynamic property.
What's the difference in performance between accessing a static one, ignoring the I/O, and accessing a dynamic one? Because you've got to go through, you've got to resolve the definition, don't you, into the cluster.
You mean, a static, the access for a static property or a dynamic property?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's about 70-80%. So not quite
2 times.
Not quite 2 times. That's right. And there's no difference. And the difference between a runtime and a design time dynamic property is 10 times, because you've got to go through there. It's the get property value, set property value over here.
Does that behave the same for null? Is assigning a string to be blank the same as assigning a null?
If you assign a static property null, then obviously you've got, if it's a 30-character string, then you've now still got a 30-character. If you assign I'm pretty sure that if you assign it to null, we will shrink the value. So effectively, we'll clear it.
Yes, but if you assign it to blank, does that leave it allocated? Or
Yes.
Is that
Yes. Blank is not null.
Well,
Null. If you use null, empty string, double quote,
yeah.
then the value is cleared. If you assigned it to quote, lots of blanks, quote, then you've assigned it to quote, lots of blanks, quote. So that's its value.
No, a blank string, an empty string.
That's null.
Right.
So that's,
Does the design tone properties, are they available in the report writer?
why not? I can't think why not. I mean, they're properties now.
Yeah,
So, yeah,
they should be there.
they should be there as well. Yeah.
Is there any way of converting existing properties to a dynamic property?
I think you've
Yeah.
a particular reason for
No,
using.
not that we have thought about. It gets discussed every now and then, but there's currently no way.
All right.
I think it's those.
So that's the question. Okay.
Excellent.